Welcome to the Saving History podcast, the sanctuary for castle devotees and medieval history enthusiasts. Prepare to embark on a thrilling voyage through time as we unveil enthralling history and legend. From ancient folklore to cutting-edge restoration, we've got it all covered. So grab your headphones and let's dive right in.
The air in St. Peter's Basilica was thick with incense and anticipation on that fateful Christmas day in the year 800, as Pope Leo III raised the golden crown above the head of the kneeling Frankish king. The assembled crowd held its breath. With a swift motion, the Pope placed the crown upon Charlemagne's brow, proclaiming him Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific Emperor of the Romans. In that moment, as cheers erupted and echoed through the cavernous basilica, neither man could have foreseen the centuries of conflict their actions would spark. This coronation, seemingly a perfect union of spiritual and temporal power, would become the cornerstone of medieval political theory and the root of bitter strife. For in crowning Charlemagne, Pope Leo had not only revived the concept of a Western Roman Empire, but had also implicitly claimed the authority to make and unmake emperors. It was a precedent that future popes would cite repeatedly in their struggles with secular rulers. To understand the significance of this act, we must look back to the tumultuous centuries that preceded it. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 had left a power vacuum in Europe. As Roman institutions crumbled, the Church often stepped in to provide stability and continuity. Bishops became de facto civic leaders, and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, gradually assumed a position of primacy among Christian leaders. In the East, the Byzantine Empire continued the Roman legacy, with emperors who claimed both secular and religious authority. But in the West, the papacy began to articulate a different vision, one where spiritual and temporal powers were separate but intertwined, with the Pope holding supreme authority in spiritual matters. This concept found powerful expression in a document known as the Donation of Constantine. Purportedly written by Emperor Constantine I in the 4th century, it granted Pope Sylvester I and his successors authority over Rome and the entire Western Empire. The document was, in fact, an 8th century forgery, but for centuries it was accepted as genuine and used to justify papal claims to temporal power. The donation painted a vivid picture. Constantine, cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester's prayers, responding with immense gratitude. The emperor was said to have handed over his crown, palace, and all imperial insignia to the Pope, declaring that the Vicar of Christ should rule over earthly kingdoms. While modern historians easily discern the anachronisms and inconsistencies in the text, medieval minds found it entirely plausible. This forged document became a cornerstone of papal political theory, supplementing biblical interpretation that already suggested papal supremacy. Popes pointed to Christ's words to Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven," Matthew 16:19, interpreting this spiritual authority as extending to earthly realms as well. As the papacy's political ambitions grew, a new concept emerged. The theory of the two swords, derived from a passage in the Gospel of Luke where the apostles say, "Look, Lord, here are two swords," and Jesus replies, "It is enough." The two swords represented spiritual and temporal power, both, they argued, given by God to Peter and his successors. According to this theory, the Pope wielded the spiritual sword directly but entrusted the temporal sword to secular rulers. This meant that while kings and emperors had genuine authority, it was ultimately derived from and answerable to papal authority. It was a theory that would have far-reaching consequences, setting the stage for centuries of conflict. As the first millennium drew to a close, these ideas were percolating through European society. The coronation of Charlemagne had created a new political reality, a Western empire that claimed the legacy of Rome but was intimately tied to papal authority. This Holy Roman Empire, as it would come to be known, was based on a delicate balance between papal and imperial power. For a time this balance held. Charlemagne and his immediate successors worked in relative harmony with the papacy, each bolstering the other's authority. But as the Carolingian Empire fractured and new dynasties rose to power, tensions began to emerge. Kings and emperors, drawing on their own religious significance as anointed rulers, began to chafe at papal interference in temporal matters. The stage was set for a clash of titanic proportions. On one side stood the heirs of Charlemagne, crowned emperors who saw themselves as God's representatives on earth, protectors of the Church, but answerable only to the Almighty. On the other side were the successors of St. Peter, armed with forged donations and creative biblical interpretations, claiming ultimate authority over all Christian realms. As the 11th century dawned, these competing visions of universal Christian authority were on a collision course. The question of who truly held supreme power, the Pope or the Emperor, would soon erupt into open conflict, and it would reshape the political and religious landscape of medieval Europe. The next chapter in this unfolding drama would centre on a fierce struggle known as the Investiture Controversy. As we turn the page to this new era, we find a church determined to reform itself and a young emperor equally determined to assert his traditional rights. The battle lines were drawn, and the first great papal-imperial conflict was about to begin. As the 11th century dawned, the delicate balance between papal and imperial power was about to shatter. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of medieval society and forever alter the relationship between church and state. At the centre of this storm stood two formidable figures, Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IX. To understand the magnitude of their clash, we must first paint a picture of Europe in the mid-11th century. It was a world in transition, where the feudal system was taking root and the Church was grappling with internal corruption. Two practices, in particular, had become sources of scandal: simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and Nicolaism, the marriage of clergy, or their keeping of concubines. Enter Hildebrand, the man who would become Pope Gregory VII. Born into a humble family in Tuscany, Hildebrand rose through the church ranks, driven by a fierce intelligence and an unshakable conviction in the supremacy of papal authority. As a close adviser to several popes, he was the architect of a reform movement aimed at purifying the Church and asserting its independence from secular control. In 1073, Hildebrand himself ascended to the papal throne, taking the name Gregory VII. With the power of the papacy now in his hands, he moved swiftly to implement his reform agenda. In 1075, he issued a decree that would light the fuse of the Investiture Controversy, the Dictatus Papae. His document was nothing short of revolutionary. In 27 brief statements, Gregory laid out a vision of papal power that was absolute and universal. That the Roman Church was founded by God alone, it declared. That the Roman pontiff alone can with right be called universal. And, perhaps most provocatively, that he may depose emperors. But Gregory's boldest move was his attack on lay investiture, the practice by which secular rulers appointed bishops and abbots, often selling these positions to the highest bidder. By forbidding this practice, Gregory struck at the heart of royal power. Bishops and abbots were not merely church officials. They were also great landowners and crucial administrators in the medieval state. Control over their appointment was a cornerstone of royal authority. On the other side of this conflict stood the young Henry IX, King of Germany and future Holy Roman Emperor. Only 23 years old when Gregory became pope, Henry had already weathered a tumultuous regency and a rebellion by Saxon nobles. He was determined to assert his authority and saw the traditional royal right of investiture as non-negotiable. The clash was inevitable. In 1075, Henry continued to appoint bishops in Italy and Germany, directly contravening Gregory's decree. The Pope responded with a letter warning Henry to obey the Church. The young king, flush with the recent victory over the Saxons, is in no mood for papal admonitions. In January 1076, Henry convened a synod of German bishops at Worms. There, he persuaded the bishops to renounce their allegiance to Gregory and drafted a scathing letter to the Pope. Henry, king, not through usurpation, but through the holy ordination of God, to Hildebrand at present, not Pope, but false monk, it began. The letter accused Gregory of overstepping his authority and concluded with a thunderous command. I, Henry, king by the grace of God, with all of my bishops say to you, come down, and be damned through all eternity. Gregory's response was equally dramatic. On February 22, 1076, he pronounced a sentence of excommunication against Henry, the first time a pope had ever deposed a reigning monarch. I prohibit Henry, son of Emperor Henry, from ruling the kingdom of the Teutons and of Italy, he declared. He also released all Christians from their oaths of allegiance to Henry. The impact was seismic. In an age of faith, excommunication was not merely a spiritual censure. It threatened the very foundations of Henry's rule. German princes, many of whom had their own grievances against Henry, saw an opportunity. They informed Henry that if he did not reconcile with the Pope within a year, they would elect a new king. Suddenly, the brash young monarch found himself in a desperate position. With his crown in jeopardy, Henry decided on an audacious gambit. In the dead of winter, he would journey across the Alps to confront the Pope in person and seek absolution. As January 1077 dawned, Gregory was staying at the castle of Canossa in northern Italy. Word reached him that Henry was approaching. For 3 days, the king stood in the snow outside the castle gates, dressed in sackcloth, begging for forgiveness. It was a scene of abject humiliation for the monarch, and a moment of supreme triumph for papal authority. On the 4th day, Gregory relented and lifted the excommunication. The walk to Canossa became one of the most dramatic episodes in medieval history, a powerful symbol of papal supremacy over secular rulers. Yet this was not the end of the conflict, but merely its opening act. The humiliation at Canossa would fuel Henry's determination to reassert his authority. The Investiture Controversy would rage on for decades, drawing in successive popes and emperors, reshaping the political landscape of Europe. As Gregory and Henry left Canossa, neither could have foreseen the long struggle ahead. The lines had been drawn in the snow of northern Italy, and the great contest between spiritual and temporal power had begun in earnest. The next phase of this epic conflict would see shifting alliances, rival claimants to both papal and imperial thrones, and a struggle that would engulf all of Christendom. The icy winds that had buffeted Canossa in January 1077 had barely subsided when the fragile peace between Pope Gregory and King Henry began to crumble. The dramatic scene of the king kneeling in the snow, begging for papal absolution, had resolved nothing. Instead, it had only set the stage for a more intense and far-reaching conflict that would reshape the political landscape of medieval Europe. As Henry IX journeyed back across the Alps, the full weight of his humiliation at Canossa settled upon him. The man who had once imperiously commanded the Pope to come down from his throne now found his own position more precarious than ever. The German princes, who had threatened to elect a new king if Henry remained excommunicated, were not mollified by his reconciliation with Gregory. They saw in Henry's weakness an opportunity to advance their own interests. In March 1077, these princes made good on their threat. Meeting in Pforzheim, they elected Rudolf of Rheinfelden as anti-king. Rudolf, the Duke of Swabia and Henry's own brother-in-law, was crowned with a circlet claiming to be the ancient crown of Charlemagne. This act plunged Germany into civil war, with Henry fighting to retain his throne against Rudolf and his allies. Gregory, for his part, refused to take sides in the conflict. The Pope, ever the canny political operator, saw advantage in letting the two claimants weaken each other while he positioned himself as the ultimate arbiter of legitimate rule. His stance, however, only served to frustrate both parties and ultimately undermined Gregory's own position. As the conflict in Germany raged on, Henry gradually gained the upper hand. His support among the common people, particularly in the growing towns and cities, proved crucial. Many saw in Henry a bulwark against the rapacious feudal nobility that backed Rudolf. The tide turned decisively in 1080, when Rudolf was killed in battle. His right hand, the hand with which he had sworn fealty to Henry, severed by a sword stroke. With his position in Germany secured, Henry turned his attention back to the troublesome Pope. Gregory, breaking his neutrality, had once again excommunicated Henry in 1080. Now, the king was ready to respond with more than words. In 1081, Henry crossed the Alps with an army, intent on removing Gregory and installing a more amenable pope. The next 4 years saw a complex military and political struggle play out across northern and central Italy. Henry, unable to immediately take Rome, installed the anti-pope Clement III in Ravenna. Gregory, for his part, sought allies among the Norman rulers of southern Italy, promising them legitimacy and papal protection in return for military support. As Henry's armies slowly tightened their grip on Rome, Gregory found himself increasingly isolated. Many Roman nobles, weary of the conflict and its impact on trade, began to turn against the Pope. In 1084, Henry finally entered Rome in triumph. Clement was installed in the Lateran Palace, and on March 31, 1084, he crowned Henry as Holy Roman Emperor. Gregory, however, was not yet defeated. Barricaded in the impregnable Castel Sant'Angelo, the ancient mausoleum of Emperor Hadrian turned papal fortress, he continued to defy Henry. The Pope pinned his hopes on the arrival of his Norman allies, led by the formidable Robert Guiscard. In May 1084, the Normans arrived outside Rome. Henry, his forces insufficient to face this new threat, withdrew north. The Normans entered the city, ostensibly as liberators, but what followed was one of the most notorious sacks in Rome's long history. For 3 days, the Norman troops pillaged the Eternal City, leaving much of it in ruins and permanently damaging Gregory's reputation among the Roman people. In the aftermath of this Pyrrhic victory, Gregory found his position untenable. Reviled by many Romans, and with Henry still in control of much of northern Italy, the Pope had no choice but to retreat south with his Norman protectors. He would never return to Rome, dying in exile in Salerno in 1085. His last words were telling, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." Gregory's death, however, did not end the Investiture Controversy. The conflict he had championed had grown beyond any single pope or emperor. Gregory's successors, particularly Urban II and Paschal II, continued to assert papal prerogatives against imperial power. Henry, for his part, found that his victory over Gregory had not resolved the fundamental issues at stake. The struggle would continue for decades, with momentum shifting back and forth between papal and imperial forces. It would not be until 1122, with the Concordat of Worms signed by Henry V and Pope Calixtus II, that a formal resolution would be reached. This compromise allowed clerics to be selected by the Church, but gave the emperor some voice in the process in his lands. The Investiture Controversy left an indelible mark on European history. It weakened imperial authority in Germany, allowing the great nobles to consolidate their territorial powers, a development that would have profound consequences for the future of the Holy Roman Empire. At the same time, it greatly enhanced papal prestige and political authority, paving the way for the great papal monarchs of the High Middle Ages. Perhaps most importantly, the controversy sparked intellectual debates about the nature of secular and spiritual authority that would continue to resonate for centuries. The relationship between church and state, so fiercely contested by Gregory and Henry, would remain a central question in European politics well into the modern era. As the dust settled on this first great clash between popes and emperors, the stage was set for new conflicts. The precedents established during the Investiture Controversy would shape future confrontations, as successive popes and emperors continue to grapple with the fundamental question: who truly held supreme authority in Christendom? A new chapter in the epic struggle between papal and imperial power was about to unfold. The year was 1152, and onto the stage of history stepped a figure who would come to embody the might and majesty of the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick I, better known to history as Frederick Barbarossa, or Redbeard. Born into the powerful Hohenstaufen dynasty, Frederick was elected King of Germany at the age of 30, at a time when memories of the tumultuous reign of Henry IX were still fresh. Tall, strong, and charismatic, with a distinctive red beard that gave him his famous moniker, Frederick seemed to his contemporaries the very model of a medieval monarch. He was determined to restore the glory of the empire, looking back to Charlemagne as his model and inspiration. Frederick's ascension came at a crucial moment in European history. The previous decades had seen the rise of a new power in Italy, the Commune. These self-governing city-states, particularly in wealthy Lombardy, had grown in strength and independence during the chaos of the Investiture Controversy. They now posed a challenge to both imperial authority and papal ambitions in the Italian peninsula. It was against this complex backdrop that Frederick began his reign. In 1154, he crossed the Alps with an army, intent on asserting imperial authority in Italy. His coronation as Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Adrian IX in 1155 seemed to herald a new era of cooperation between empire and papacy. But this harmony would prove short-lived. The first cracks in the relationship appeared during the coronation itself. As was customary, Frederick was to hold the Pope's stirrup as he mounted his horse, a symbolic act of respect and service. Frederick initially balked at this, seeing it as beneath his dignity. Only after much negotiation did he agree to perform the ritual, and even then chroniclers noted he did so with poor grace. This incident, trivial as it might seem, highlighted the tension inherent in the relationship between Pope and Emperor. Each saw himself as God's representative on earth, and each was determined to assert his authority over Christendom. The stage was set for conflict. The flashpoint came in 1157 when Adrian IX issued a letter to Frederick that used the word beneficium to describe the imperial crown. This Latin term could be interpreted either as benefit or as fief, and Frederick chose to interpret it in the most provocative way possible. To suggest that the empire was a papal fief was an intolerable insult to imperial dignity. Frederick's fury was immense. At a diet in Besancon, he had the letter read aloud, then launched into a tirade against papal presumption. From whom then does the emperor hold the empire, if not from the pope? One of the papal legates unwisely asked. Otto of Wittelsbach, the imperial Count Palatine, nearly struck the legate down with his sword, and only Frederick's intervention prevented bloodshed. This incident marked the beginning of a prolonged struggle between Frederick and a succession of popes. The conflict was not just about abstract authority, but had very real political implications, particularly in Italy. Frederick saw the wealthy communes of northern Italy as rightfully subject to imperial authority and a much-needed source of revenue for his campaigns. The papacy, wary of too powerful an emperor, often supported the communes in their resistance. In 1158, Frederick launched his second Italian campaign, determined to subjugate the Lombard cities. His initial success was impressive. He captured and razed the rebellious city of Milan, scattering salt on its ruins in an ancient symbol of total destruction. At the Diet of Roncaglia, he proclaimed a series of laws asserting extensive imperial rights in Italy. But Frederick had overreached. His harsh policies sparked widespread resentment, and in 1167 many of the northern Italian cities united to form the Lombard League, swearing to resist imperial authority. They found a ready ally in Pope Alexander III, who had been engaged in a bitter struggle with Frederick over papal election. Frederick had supported a series of anti-popes against Alexander, leading to a schism in the church. Now, the conflict between papal and imperial authority became intertwined with the struggle between the emperor and the Italian communes. It was a three-way contest that would define Italian politics for decades. The climax of this long struggle came in 1176 at the Battle of Legnano. Frederick, leading an army south to subdue his enemies, met the combined forces of the Lombard League. In a stunning upset, the imperial army was routed, and Frederick himself was thought for several days to have died in the battle. This defeat forced Frederick to reconsider his policies. In 1177, he finally made peace with Pope Alexander, literally kissing the Pope's feet in a ceremony of reconciliation in Venice. The scene was reminiscent of Canossa, a century earlier, but with a crucial difference. This time the humiliation was more symbolic than real. Frederick remained a powerful and respected ruler, and the peace was more a mutual saving compromise than a total submission. The Peace of Venice marked a turning point in Frederick's reign. Although he never fully abandoned his claims in Italy, he focused more of his energies on consolidating his power in Germany. He also turned his attention eastward, launching the Third Crusade in 1189. But fate had one final twist in store for the red-bearded emperor. In 1190, while crossing the Salef River in Anatolia, Frederick Barbarossa drowned, a prosaic end for a larger-than-life figure. Frederick's long reign had seen the imperial-papal conflict evolve into a more complex struggle involving the rising power of the Italian city-states. He had not succeeded in fully subjugating either the papacy or the communes, but he had maintained and even enhanced the prestige of the empire. His legend would grow after his death, with stories circulating that he was not dead but merely sleeping in a mountain, waiting to return in Germany's hour of need. As the 12th century drew to a close, the struggle between popes and emperors was far from over. New players would enter the stage, and the conflict would take on new dimensions. But the era of Frederick Barbarossa had shown that the issues first raised during the Investiture Controversy remained unresolved. The question of supremacy between spiritual and temporal power would continue to shape European history for centuries to come. As the 12th century drew to a close, the long struggle between popes and emperors entered a new phase. The year was 1198. And onto the papal throne ascended a man who would transform the papacy into the supreme power in Christendom, Innocent III. Born Lotario da Conti di Seni, this scion of a noble Roman family was only 37 when he donned the papal tiara. He was young for a pope, but possessed of a brilliant legal mind and an unshakable conviction in papal supremacy. Innocent came to power at a moment ripe with opportunity. The Holy Roman Empire was in disarray following the death of Henry VI, with rival claimants vying for the imperial crown. England and France were locked in conflict, and the kingdoms of Spain were consumed by their centuries, long reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. Into this power vacuum stepped Innocent, armed with the expansive vision of papal authority that he called papal monarchy. This concept went beyond even the most ambitious claims of his predecessors. Innocent asserted that the Pope was no mere spiritual leader, but the vicar of Christ on earth, placed by God between priesthood and royalty. The Lord left to Peter the governance, not of the Church only, but of the whole world, he proclaimed. This ideology would form the basis for a dramatic expansion of papal power. Innocent wasted no time in putting his theories into practice. In the Holy Roman Empire, he exploited the succession crisis to assert papal authority over the election of the emperor. When the two main claimants, Philip of Swabia and Otto of Brunswick, appealed to him for support, Innocent issued a detailed legal opinion, the Deliberatio, which not only judged the merits of each candidate, but asserted the Pope's right to make this judgment. Ultimately, Innocent backed Otto, extracting significant concessions in return for his support. When Otto later reneged on his promises, Innocent smoothly switched his support to the young Frederick II, son of Henry VI. His political manoeuvring demonstrated the Pope's newfound role as kingmaker in imperial politics. But Innocent's ambitions extended far beyond the empire. In 1202, he promulgated the Decretal Venerabilum, which claimed for the papacy the right to examine the person of anyone chosen as emperor. This was a startling assertion of papal authority over the most powerful secular ruler in Christendom. Innocent's intervention in English politics was even more dramatic. When King John refused to accept the Pope's choice for Archbishop of Canterbury, Innocent placed all of England under interdict in 1208. For 6 years, church bells fell silent across the land, the dead were buried in unconsecrated ground, and the sacraments were withheld from the laity. Facing a threatened French invasion and a rebellious nobility, John finally submitted to the Pope in 1213. In a public ceremony heavy with symbolism, the English king surrendered his crown to the papal legate and received it back as a papal fief. England was now, in theory, a vassal state of the Holy See. It was a stunning demonstration of the papacy's ability to humble even a powerful monarch. Innocent's influence extended to all corners of Christendom. He arbitrated disputes between European monarchs called for, and initially controlled, the Fourth Crusade, and launched the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathar heretics in southern France. This last action, while ostensibly a matter of religious orthodoxy, had profound political implications. By backing the Crusaders, Innocent helped to bring the semi-independent lands of Languedoc under the control of the French crown. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 marked the zenith of Innocent's power and the culmination of his vision for the Church. Attended by over 1,000 churchmen and ambassadors from across Christendom, it was the largest church council held up to that time. The council promulgated 70 reforming decrees, touching on everything from church governance to the conduct of crusades. It mandated annual confession for all Christians and officially sanctioned the doctrine of transubstantiation, profoundly shaping Catholic theology and practice for centuries to come. Yet even at this moment of triumph, the seeds of future conflict were being sown. The very expansion of papal power under Innocent would provoke a backlash from secular rulers in the coming decades. The presidency established would be used by future popes to make ever more extravagant claims, eventually overreaching and undermining the papacy's authority. Moreover, Innocent's use of spiritual sanctions for political ends, most notably the interdict, risked cheapening these powerful weapons. Future popes would find that such tactics, used too often, lost their ability to awe and compel obedience. Innocent died in 1216, leaving behind a papacy that stood at the pinnacle of its temporal power. He had realized, to a remarkable degree, the dream of a papal monarchy that could command obedience from emperors and kings. Yet this very success contained with it the seeds of future conflict and decline. As the 13th century progressed, new players would enter the stage. The Emperor Frederick II, once Innocent's protégé, would prove to be one of the papacy's most formidable adversaries. The French monarchy, strengthened in part by papal support, would increasingly assert its independence from Rome. And across Europe a new sense of national identity was beginning to emerge that would challenge the universalist claims of both papacy and empire. The era of Innocent III represented the high watermark of papal power in medieval Europe. From this zenith, the tide would eventually recede, but the questions raised during his pontificate about the nature of spiritual and temporal authority, the limits of papal power, and the relationship between church and state would continue to shape European history for centuries to come. In the wake of Innocent III's powerful papacy, a new figure emerged who would challenge the very foundations of papal authority. Frederick II, crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1220, was a man of extraordinary talents and contradiction. Known to his contemporaries as Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world, Frederick was a ruler whose reign would mark a dramatic new chapter in the centuries-long struggle between popes and emperors. Born in 1194 in Gizeh, Italy, Frederick was the son of the Emperor Henry VI and Constance of Sicily. Orphaned at the age of 4, he became a ward of none other than Pope Innocent. It was a twist of fate that would have profound consequences for the future of Europe. Innocent, seeing an opportunity to shape the future emperor, supported Frederick's claim to the imperial throne against rival claimants. Little did the Pope know that his protégé would grow to become the papacy's most formidable adversary. Frederick's early years were spent in Sicily, an island at the crossroads of Latin, Greek, and Arab cultures. This cosmopolitan upbringing profoundly shaped the future emperor. Fluent in 6 languages, including Arabic, Frederick developed a lifelong fascination with science, philosophy, and the arts. He was a patron of poets, a legislator, and even an accomplished falconer who wrote a respected treatise on the subject. This intellectual curiosity, combined with his political acumen, made Frederick a ruler unlike any other in medieval Europe. As Frederick came of age, he began to assert his independence from papal tutelage. His vision for the empire was grand and far-reaching. He sought to create a centralized, bureaucratic state centered on Sicily, with ambitions to dominate both Germany and Italy. This dream, if realized, would have effectively encircled the papal states, a prospect that alarmed the popes. The first major conflict between Frederick and the papacy came over the issue of crusading. Frederick had taken a crusader's vow at his imperial coronation in 1220, a promise encouraged by the papal legate. However, year after year, Frederick delayed his departure for the Holy Land, much to the frustration of Pope Honorius III and his successor, Gregory IX. In 1227, Frederick finally set sail, only to return 3 days later, claiming illness. Gregory, seeing this as the last straw, excommunicated the emperor. It was an unprecedented move, excommunicating a crusader en route to the Holy Land, and it marked the beginning of a bitter, decades-long struggle between Frederick and the papacy. Undeterred by papal censure, Frederick embarked for the Holy Land in 1228, still under excommunication. What followed was one of the most remarkable episodes in crusading history. Through diplomacy, rather than warfare, Frederick negotiated a treaty with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil, securing Christian control over Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth. On March 18, 1229, Frederick crowned himself King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This bloodless crusade was a stunning achievement, but it enraged Gregory. The Pope had forbidden anyone to assist the excommunicate emperor, and now Frederick had succeeded where decades of papal-sanctioned crusades had failed. Moreover, the treaty with al-Kamil, which allowed Muslims to retain their mosques in Jerusalem, seemed to the Pope a betrayal of Christian interest. Returning to Italy, Frederick found his lands invaded by papal armies. The emperor quickly turned the tables, driving back the papal forces and forcing Gregory to absolve him of excommunication in the Peace of San Germano in 1230. But this reconciliation was short-lived. The fundamental issue remained unresolved. Frederick's conception of imperial authority was incompatible with papal claims of supremacy. This ideological conflict was exacerbated by practical politics, particularly Frederick's efforts to assert imperial control over northern Italy, which the Pope saw as a threat to their own position. In 1239, Gregory again excommunicated Frederick, this time on a sweeping set of charges including heresy. The Pope compared the emperor to the Antichrist, while Frederick responded by casting himself as the true defender of Christianity against a corrupt and worldly papacy. Both sides marshalled legal arguments and propaganda in a war of words that paralleled their military conflicts. Frederick's intellectual court became a centre of resistance to papal claims. His chancellor, Pierre Delvine, articulated a theory of imperial power that presented the emperor as a living law on earth, directly appointed by God. This was a direct challenge to papal ideology, which claimed that all earthly authority derived from and was subject to papal authority. The conflict reached its climax under Pope Innocent IX, who fled to Lyon in 1244 to escape Frederick's armies. In 1245, Innocent convened a church council that formally deposed Frederick as emperor. It was the most extreme assertion of papal authority over temporal rulers since the days of Gregory VII and Henry IX. Frederick, however, refused to accept this deposition. The final years of his reign were consumed by war in Italy and Germany, as he fought to maintain his power against papal-supported rivals. Despite some military successes, the conflict took its toll. Frederick died in 1250, his grand imperial project unfinished. The reign of Frederick II marked a crucial turning point in the relationship between the papacy and the empire. While the popes had seemingly triumphed over Frederick, their victory came at a great cost. The extreme measures used against Frederick, multiple excommunications, charges of heresy, deposition, had weakened the impact of these spiritual weapons. Moreover, the papacy's heavy involvement in temporal politics during this conflict would lead to a backlash in the coming centuries. Frederick's legacy was complex. To some, he was the last great medieval emperor, a man ahead of his time in his secular outlook and his intellectual pursuits. To others, he was a threat to the divinely ordained order, a heretic who had consorted with Muslims and challenged the authority of the Church. What is clear is that his reign marked the last great struggle between the universal claims of empire and papacy. As the 13th century progressed, new powers were rising. The kingdoms of France and England were growing stronger, and a sense of national identity was beginning to emerge across Europe. The stage was set for a new phase in the ongoing drama of spiritual and temporal authority, one in which new players would challenge the old order and redefine the relationship between church and state. As the 13th century drew to a close, the political landscape of Europe was undergoing a profound transformation. The great struggle between popes and emperors, which had dominated medieval politics for centuries, was giving way to a new conflict. The rising power of national monarchies, particularly France, was about to challenge papal authority in ways that would forever alter the relationship between church and state. At the centre of this new drama stood two formidable figures, King Philip IX of France, known as Philip the Fair, and Pope Boniface VIII. Their clash would mark the beginning of the end of the medieval papacy's pretensions to universal authority and herald the dawn of the modern nation-state. Philip ascended to the French throne in 1285 at the age of 17. Tall, handsome, and taciturn, he was nicknamed the Fair not just for his appearance, but for his even-handed, almost impassive demeanour. Yet behind this calm exterior lay a ruthless determination to strengthen royal power, and a sharp mind adept at manipulating legal and financial systems to his advantage. Under Philip's rule, France was becoming the most powerful and centralized kingdom in Europe. He surrounded himself with skilled lawyers and administrators, many from humble backgrounds who were loyal to the crown, rather than to feudal or ecclesiastical interests. These men, derisively called legists by their enemies, provided Philip with the intellectual and legal ammunition to assert royal authority against all rivals, including the Church. On the papal throne sat Boniface, elected in 1294, after the unprecedented abdication of his predecessor, Celestine V. Boniface was, in many ways, the last great medieval pope. Learned, imperious, and utterly convinced of the papacy's right to supremacy over all Christian rulers, he seemed almost a throwback to the days of Innocent III. But the world had changed, and Boniface would learn this lesson the hard way. The conflict between Philip and Boniface began over the issue of taxation. The long war between France and England had strained Philip's finances, leading him to impose heavy taxes, including on the French clergy. This was a direct challenge to the traditional immunity of church property from royal taxation, and Boniface responded forcefully. In 1296, he issued the bull Clericis Laicos, forbidding the clergy to pay taxes to lay rulers without papal permission. Philip's response was swift and pragmatic. He simply banned the export of gold, silver, and precious gems from France, cutting off a crucial source of papal revenue. Faced with this economic warfare, Boniface was forced to backtrack, issuing conciliatory bulls that allowed clerical taxation in emergencies. But this was only the opening salvo in a longer conflict. In 1301, Philip arrested Bernard Cesset, the Bishop of Pamiers, on charges of treason. This was a direct affront to the principle of clerical immunity from secular justice. Boniface responded with the bull Ausculta Fili, listen, son, rebuking Philip and asserting papal supremacy in the strongest terms. Philip's court was ready with a counterstroke. They circulated a crude forgery called the Little Bull, which purported to show Boniface claiming direct sovereignty over France. This propaganda coup turned French public opinion against the Pope. In a dramatic gesture, Philip publicly burned the real papal bull in Paris. The conflict reached its climax with Boniface's promulgation of the Bull Unam Sanctam in November 1302. This document represented the most extreme statement of papal supremacy ever made. It declared that submission to the Pope was necessary for salvation, and that the Pope held both spiritual and temporal swords, merely delegating the latter to earthly rulers. Philip responded by convening an assembly of French nobles, clergy, and commons in 1303. This assembly, a precursor to the Estates General, accused Boniface of heresy, simony, and a litany of other crimes. Philip's chief minister, Guillaume de Nogaret, was dispatched to Italy with orders to arrest the Pope and bring him to France for trial. What followed was one of the most shocking episodes in medieval history. On September 7, 1303, Nogaret and his Italian allies found Boniface in his hometown of Anagni. They stormed the papal palace and confronted the 86-year-old Pope. According to legend, Boniface met his attackers wearing full papal regalia, declaring, "Here is my neck, here is my head. I will die, but I will die Pope." For 3 days, Boniface was held captive, as Nogaret tried to force him to abdicate. The Pope refused and was reportedly struck in the face by one of his captors, an echo of the humiliation of Christ that sent shockwaves through Christendom. Finally, the townspeople of Anagni rallied and drove out the attackers, freeing Boniface. But the aged Pope was broken by the ordeal. He returned to Rome, where he died a month later. The outrage of Anagni, as it came to be known, marked a turning point in the history of church-state relations. Never again would a pope be able to claim the kind of universal authority that Boniface had asserted. The inviolability of the pope's person had been shattered, along with the mystique of papal power. Philip's victory was complete. The next pope, Clement V, was a Frenchman who owed his election to Philip's influence. In 1309, Clement moved the papal court to Avignon, beginning the so-called Babylonian captivity of the papacy under French control. The conflict between Philip and Boniface had far-reaching consequences. It demonstrated the rising power of national monarchies and their ability to challenge papal authority. The legal and propaganda techniques developed by Philip's government would become models for future assertions of royal power against ecclesiastical privileges. Moreover, the conflict highlighted the dangers of the papacy's involvement in temporal politics. By acting as a political player, the papacy had made itself vulnerable to political attacks. Future reformers would point to this period as evidence of the need to separate church and state. As the 14th century dawned, the medieval vision of a universal Christendom, united under the dual leadership of Pope and Emperor, was fading. In its place was emerging a Europe of nation-states, where kings would increasingly claim the kind of absolute authority once reserved for popes and emperors. The age-old struggle between spiritual and temporal power was entering a new phase, one that would ultimately lead to the Reformation and the birth of the modern world. As the dust settled on the dramatic conflict between Philip of France and Pope Boniface, Europe stood on the brink of a new era. The centuries-long struggle between popes and emperors, and later between the papacy and rising national monarchies, had profoundly reshaped the political, social, and intellectual landscape of the continent. As we survey the aftermath of these epic confrontations, we can trace the emergence of ideas and institutions that would define the modern world. The decline of universal claims was perhaps the most immediate consequence of these conflicts. The notion of Christendom as a single unified entity under the dual leadership of Pope and Emperor had been irreparably fractured. In its place arose a Europe of emerging nation-states, each asserting its own sovereignty and unique identity. This transformation was particularly evident in the changing nature of kingship. Monarchs like Philip of France had successfully challenged papal authority, not just through force of arms, but through sophisticated legal and propaganda campaigns. They increasingly styled themselves as emperors within their own realms, answerable to no higher earthly authority. The doctrine of the divine right of kings, which would reach its apex in the absolutist monarchies of the 17th century, had its roots in these medieval conflicts. The papacy, too, was forever altered by these struggles. The Avignon papacy and the subsequent Western Schism dramatically undermined papal prestige and authority. No longer could popes credibly claim the kind of universal jurisdiction over temporal affairs that Innocent III or Boniface VIII had asserted. Instead, the papacy increasingly came to be seen as just one player among many in the complex game of European power politics. These conflicts also had a profound impact on political thought. The need to articulate and defend the rights of both spiritual and temporal authorities spurred the development of sophisticated legal and philosophical arguments. Thinkers like Marsilius of Padua, in his work Defensa Pacis, Defender of Peace, challenged traditional views of papal authority, arguing for a separation of church and state and laying the groundwork for later theories of popular sovereignty. The great poet Dante Alighieri, writing in the aftermath of the struggles between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire, offered his own vision of world order in the Monarchia. Dante argued for a universal monarchy to bring peace to the world, but one strictly limited to temporal affairs, with the church confined to spiritual matters. While Dante's specific prescriptions were never realized, his insistence on separating spiritual and temporal powers would prove influential. The conflicts between popes and secular rulers also had unintended consequences for the development of representative institutions. Assemblies like the French Estates General, originally convened by Philip to support his struggle against Boniface, became forums for broader political participation. In England, the parliaments summoned by Edward I to approve taxation for his wars laid the foundation for the development of constitutional monarchy. Moreover, the papal-imperial conflicts contributed to the growth of bureaucracies and administrative systems. Both secular and ecclesiastical authorities developed more sophisticated methods of governance, record-keeping and taxation as they vied for supremacy. These administrative innovations would prove crucial in the formation of early modern states. The long struggle also left its mark on European culture and education. Universities, many of which had been founded under papal patronage, became centres of debate over the nature of spiritual and temporal authority. The study of Roman law, revived in part to provide legal ammunition in these conflicts, would profoundly influence the development of European legal systems. Perhaps most significantly, these conflicts sowed the seeds of the Reformation. The spectacle of worldly popes engaged in power politics the abuse of spiritual sanctions for political ends, and the heavy taxation of the clergy to support these struggles all contributed to growing criticism of the Church. Reformers in the 16th century would point to these abuses as evidence of need for a fundamental overhaul of ecclesiastical institutions. As Europe entered the 14th century, new challenges arose that would further transform the continent. The Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and the Renaissance would reshape European society in ways that the great popes and emperors of the past could scarcely have imagined. Yet the legacy of their conflicts continued to shape events. The idea of Europe as a collection of sovereign states rather than a unified Christendom would be formalized in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This treaty, which ended the 30 Years' War, is often seen as the birth of the modern international system. It enshrined the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm is religion, definitively ending the idea that either pope or emperor could impose religious uniformity across Europe. As we conclude our journey through the centuries-long struggle between popes and emperors, we can see how this conflict shaped the very foundations of modern Europe. From the dramatic confrontation between Henry IV and Gregory VII at Canossa through the epic struggles of Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II to the final clash between Philip and Boniface, each episode added new dimensions to this fundamental debate about the nature of authority and the proper ordering of society. These conflicts, while often centered on the specific persons of popes and rulers, were never merely personal. They represented a clash of ideologies, a contest between competing visions of how the Christian world should be governed. In the process, they spurred developments in law, political theory, and institutions that would long outlast the original protagonists. The legacy of these conflicts is all around us in the modern world. In the separation of church and state enshrined in many constitutions, in the ongoing debates about the role of religion in public life in the international system of sovereign states, and in the fundamental questions we continue to grapple with about the nature and limits of political authority, we can trace the echoes of those long-ago disputes. In the end, the story of popes and emperors is not just a tale of long-ago conflicts, but a critical chapter in the ongoing human endeavor to create just and workable systems of governance. It is a reminder that the political and social structures we often take for granted are the product of centuries of struggle, debate, and gradual evolution. As we continue to grapple with these fundamental questions in our own era, we would do well to remember the lessons of this epic historical drama. And thus concludes another chapter in our ongoing exploration of medieval history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. If you've enjoyed today's episode and want to delve deeper into the fascinating world of the Middle Ages, I invite you to join our community on Patreon. Find the link in our description or search for the Saving History channel on Patreon. Our subscribers get access to exclusive bonus episodes, early releases, and a wealth of additional medieval content. Don't forget to subscribe to Saving History on your favorite podcast platform to ensure you never miss an episode. Remember, in understanding our past, we gain insight into our present. Until our next historical adventure, this is your host, Hunter, encouraging you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep saving history.